Okay, so assuming you have gone through the basics on CASes, so this lecture will be a high-level overview on some of the CAS attacks that are possible in modern processors. Okay, so this logistics will come back later. Let's start with the slide that I discussed on the very first day. So you must have heard about all this micro architectural components like caches, TLB, branch predictors, prefetcher. There are so many other micro architectural structures or ideas that are sitting inside your chip, and their goal is to hide latency. That's why they play a big role in improving performance. So for example, I don't know whether you follow the latest Apple M1 chip, right? So if you look at that, just based on the new micro architectural improvements or the enhancement that they proposed, uh, that kind of improved the Apple revenue by, I think, from $24 million to $40 million or something like that, in that range. Just micro architecture part. I'm not talking about the OS, the other system stack or whatever, right? So these ideas, they actually play a big role because at the end of the day, the performance matters. The delay, the slowness, whatever you get while using your mobile or iPad, that has its own implications, and then that's how the market works, right? But all these ideas that are proposed in last 30, 40 years by the architecture community, they hide latency, but now they have become the source of information leakage, right? So wherever you find an idea that kind of tries to improve performance, you will find that, okay, there is a possibility of information leakage. We will see how. So this slide I showed you on the very first lecture, but today we'll go through it in a bit detail. So I talked about this CIA properties, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So let's go through one of them. The first one, let's say the confidentiality. Uh, so keep cache in mind or memory in mind, and think about multiple processes or multiple applications running on a multi-core system to make it simple. So the confidentiality deals with the simple mantra that you don't see what you're not supposed to see. Okay. So this means a process or a core or a processor should not get a permission to read, or it should not be able to send a load request to memory or cache where it was not supposed to. Meaning, if the operating system itself hasn't given the permission to read, then from the microarchitectural perspective, your caches, other microarchitectural units like branch predictor, prefetcher, or whatever, they should not provide a way through which a process or a core would be able to read something. Okay, so this is pretty simple statement. So if something is not mapped to your address space, that means you are not supposed to access it. That provides the confidentiality, right? But because of, let's say, some other ways, if you are violating that or you are able to get the information, then that is actually breaking this rule of confidentiality. Integrity is one step ahead on top of confidentiality, and it is more dangerous because now it says you should not change or write something where you are not supposed to see something. For example, I don't have permission to access address A, but there are attacks which can go to address A and change the content of address A, let's say from 100 to 1000 or 1000 to 0, right? So this is more critical in terms of if you look at the damage that it can uh, that it can lead to from the system security point of view. The final is the availability. It's pretty simple. It's like when you have limited resources, for example, your cache, it's a limited size resource, right? Few MBs, few KBs. What if an attacker or what if a spy tries to, just access junk code or just try to get junk data by writing a for loop accessing random locations, right? What will happen? The cache will be busy just responding to those requests. And if there are other processes they are trying to access the data from the cache that time, they will be delayed, right? So this is the simple example that you can correlate with this particular property is the denial of service attack. So intentionally, you are actually denying the service. Here, the service is, let's say, the cache memory or the main memory or any microarchitectural unit. Okay. Uh, so we'll start with the confidentiality part today, and then slowly we'll go into integrity and availability maybe in the next few months. Okay. So before we jump into the confidentiality part, this is a toy example from a famous algorithm, which is known as the modular exponential algorithm. And you can assume that this is a software, right? So this is an algorithm which is eventually written in, let's say, some C, C++ code, or maybe it is implemented as a library. And this library is kind of used by multiple processes in multiple cores, for example. Okay. So now if you look at this code, there are mainly three statements which are of importance. Okay. Let's assume that there is an array called E, which is of, let's say, length n. And for each index of that array, there is some operation that is happening. For example, if a particular index in the array is 1, then you are doing a multiply operation and then reduce. So reduce is nothing but the modulo. Okay. But if a particular bit is only 0, then you are not performing this operation. You are just performing square followed by reduce. Okay. So now if you think from the access pattern point of view, right? We are talking about memory accesses, the kind of request that will go into the memory hierarchy. So when a particular bit is 0, you will get requests to square and reduce functions. Let's assume these are functions which are, they have their own addresses, so they will be cached, right? It would be there, L1 cache, L2 cache, and all. And whenever a particular index bit is 1, you can assume that you are accessing the addresses which corresponds to the square reduce along with the multiply reduce, right? So this is the proxy now. If a particular bit is 0, that means it's a square reduce. If a particular bit is 1, then it is square reduce followed by multiply reduce. Okay. And the goal of the attacker or the spy is to get the value of this E. You need a sequence of zeros and ones so that finally you will be able to say that, okay, this is the secret key that a process was operating on. Okay. So this is again a pretty high level view. You won't go into the detail. We'll provide you the code so that you can see it and then you can run it on your laptop and see how these things are happening. So once we know that, there is a control flow dependency here. So depending on the condition here, there are few accesses. If this condition is false, there is only one, square and reduce, right? Now, how can you
Okay.
map this into?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yes, so here B and N are supposed to be known to the attacker.
At this moment, it's actually not relevant. The kind of discussion that we are planning to have now. Okay. So it depends on the attack, but so far we haven't discussed any attack. Okay, once we
Okay.
start discussing about an attack, we need to discuss about the threat model, what exactly the attacker knows, what are the possibilities, and blah, 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 right? That's why I said
Okay.
it's a high level view where the goal of the attacker is to just observe some accesses to the memory or cache in the form of addresses to these functions. And finally, kind of, conclude that, okay, these are the sequence of zeros and ones. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay. So now let's see how caches can actually leak information. So we have been discussing that caches are useful to hide latency so that you won't go to the main memory. But now this plot, what I'm showing is in the y-axis, I'm showing the latency to, load something. Let's say you have an array or the array that we are talking about, or let's say the addresses for these functions, right? The square, modulo, reduce, and then the multiply, right? So what if you have these addresses and you are just trying to load them again and again, right? So, and this is the latency for that. So every time you load, you measure the latency. Okay, how many cycles it took, right? So sometimes it took 300 cycles, sometimes it took 100 cycles, and blah blah blah, right? But now what you can deduce based on the kind of latency variations that you are seeing, that some of the accesses are actually coming from the cache. That's why the access latency is just less than 100 cycles. It's either coming from L1, L2, or L3 cache, and there are some accesses which are actually going to the memory, right? Which means it's taking more cycles. Let's say closer to 300 cycles, right? So the accesses which are there in the cache, they are the accesses of interest or the address of interest. Why? Because the attacker wants to know whether someone else, right, some other process, some other core has actually brought some address into the cache. Let's put it that way for the time being. Okay. And if you look at the lower part of the plot, you will find that there is a nice pattern coming in. Depending on which particular address you got a low latency, right, faster latency, you can easily correlate with, this part is just for 0, this part is 0, this part is 1, and like that, right? So finally you get a string of zeros and ones, which you can correlate with the actual key that is used by any other core running process in a multi-core system. Okay. So again, it's still at a high level. I am not giving you so much detail for the time being. It's still at a high level. We'll go into the details slowly, one by one. So before we jump into the security part of it, I just want to provide a 10,000 feet view of multi-core system and shared caches in multi-core system. So in your undergrad, you must have studied about a single core, single processor, and multiple levels of cache. But in multi-core, you will have multiple cores having their own private caches in the form of level 1, level 2 cache, L1, L2. All of them are running different applications, completely independent. But there is a catch here. There is a shared cache which is shared by all the cores. Okay. And the example that I gave just in the previous slide is that, let's say one of the processes actually operating on that library, and the other guy wants to observe whether this guy is actually accessing those addresses. Through observing the latency to this last level cache, the attacker or the spy will be able to infer what exactly is the key. Okay. So a pretty trivial question that comes into mind is why to have a shared cache? If security is a problem, why not have private cache, right? Even if you have, let's say, 100 core system, you can have you know, a big private cache for each of them, or you can have a gigantic, 1 GB of shared cache that is shared by all the cores, right? So the point is you can't have a big cache that is shared by all the cores because the latency will go up. Once the capacity increases, the latency also increases, and it also brings into picture the notion of bandwidth. When multiple cores try to access a particular address, they will start interfering with each other, right? Instead, what modern processor have is they actually find, some of the applications are kind of fitting into their own cache. That means the working set, their memory requirement is pretty minimum, a few KBs, let's say, and a few applications, let's say they demand few MBs, right? So now if you go for a shared cache, this is a best of both the world. For example, if this guy core 0 is demanding just few KBs, but the last level cache is now can be utilized completely by core 1, right? But if you go for a private cache, then let's say I divide this LLC into two parts, right? Then half of this LLC will be useless because core 0 is not utilizing it. So it's a dynamic cache hierarchy, you can say, by design, which provides a good sweet spot for all kinds of applications that we run. So before I wrap it up, one thing that I want to mention here is the last level cache in modern processors. You take it any Intel or AMD machine, you will find the last level caches they are usually sliced or what is called banked. Okay, so the notion of slicing is if I have a large cache, the latency will go up and the bandwidth will also be a problem. Multiple cores are trying to access and they will delay each other's response, right? Instead, you kind of create small chunks and then kind of uh, assume that they are kind of designed or they are placed in isolation, right? Although the slices are, they look like they are kind of closer to some core, they are actually shared by all the cores. So any core can access any slice. Yeah, the latency will vary depending on how closer this particular slice is. Otherwise, this is a shared LLC with multiple slices. So you can assume that if you have a 8 MB, let's say L3 cache, now that 8 MB L3 cache is divided into 4 2 MB slices. Okay, and this is widely used in all the commercial machines that you are using in today's world.
Sir,
Yeah, go on.
is the slicing related to increasing number of ports?
Kind of, right? So the bandwidth that we are talking about is indirectly the door, right? So a port is nothing but the door to get the data, right? So if you keep on increasing number of ports, then it will be a pretty the complexity will be huge from the microarchitecture or hardware designer perspective. Instead, you make it a small cache, each having their own port, and anyone can access it. Right?
Okay, and why you put those colors there?
Yeah, the colors are actually don't get confused with the private cache. So the notion here is slice 0 is closer to core 0. Okay, that means if core 0 gets a miss in this particular L2 cache, it will actually search everywhere. So this is an interconnect called ring. You will actually put a request here. The request will be actually probed by all the cores and all the slices. But if you get a response from here, it will be faster. Like physically, the wire length is, it's a smaller distance compared to other slices. So you may calculate this latency on your, Intel laptop. You will find that, okay, you will get your data in, let's say 20 cycles from this slice, and maybe from this slice, you will take around 40 to 60 cycles.
So,
Yeah, go on.
sorry. So what I was asking ki, like, is there any thing in hardware which can help or which can control the data placement? Like,
Exactly. So the index bits that we have been using for our set numbering, right? Now there will be few bits inside the indexing that will tell you the slice number.
oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's not, it's not publicly disclosed, but there are papers where folks have reverse engineered the Intel hash function or the Intel indexing function that have been used. So it's a combination of various hash functions that finally give you a slice number along with a set number.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
What does that rings supposed to do?
Okay, so ring is nothing but an interconnect. If you have heard about a bus, then that's what it is, but it's a scalable interconnect. Okay, it's interconnect meaning it's connecting multiple entities, right?
Right.
So anyone wants to get a data from anyone else, they have to put a request in this ring. And others will just probe this ring and say that, okay, is there a request for me? Oh, okay, so I have the data, I will respond.
Is it a ring protocol or something like that?
Yes. If you have gone through basic computer network ring topology, this is same. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you have a question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sahil here. So yeah, I wanted to know, like, since you just mentioned that in Intel there is some sort of hashing used to find out which slice is going to be accessed. So what if there was a core which was working on a memory intensive workload and therefore probably required two slices to hold all its contents rather than one?
Yeah, that is possible. So the hashing function that Intel has designed, it's basically it's a collection of XOR functions from multiple bits. So if you have a 30-bit address, you have few bits for indexing, right? So it takes few bits from tag, few bits from index, and put multiple XOR function, and finally it will give you a slice number. So it makes sure that all these requests are kind of scattered. So to give a simple example, if you are accessing, let's say, for loop within that an array, let's say A0, A1, A2, A3, right? A simple hash function will be your A0 will be mapped here, A1 will be mapped here, A2 will be here, and A3 will be here. So in this way, all the 4 requests can be responded concurrently.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Any other questions? Doing on time. Okay. Okay. So let me move on to another key point, which is about the nature of hierarchy, nature of cache hierarchy. So the first of its kind is called an inclusive cache hierarchy. As the name suggests, it means whatever data is present in your private L1, L2 cache, it's also there in LLC. That means LLC is inclusive of L1, L2. So the idea is actually proposed to make something else simple that I won't discuss now, but this is how it works. So the moment you get a response from memory, you put the data in LLC and then you put the data in L1, L2. But if you are replacing something from the LLC, you have to make sure that you invalidate that block from the private L1, L2. Why? Because this guy is a superset of all the upper level caches. Okay. Modern machines, at least from last few years, you will find the cache hierarchies are actually non-inclusive in nature. So which means there is no binding between these 2 levels of cache or 3 levels of caches. And on a response, the data goes to LLC. It also goes to the upper level. But when you replace something from the last level cache, you don't invalidate or you don't kick out something from the private cache as there is no binding. Okay. The other extreme, there are few commercial machines that use this exclusive cache hierarchy, where the response from memory directly goes to private cache. It doesn't go to the last level cache. So now you can imagine for all the thrashing workloads, it's good, right? So your LLC won't be underutilized unnecessarily. Instead, you put it here, and whenever the block is replaced from the private cache, it will be placed in the last level cache. It's like a big victim cache. Okay. So this is exclusive cache hierarchy. But most of the cache attacks that are proposed so far, they mostly deal with inclusive cache hierarchy. But there are some recent attacks which are also attacking on non-inclusive machines. Okay. So any questions so far before I jump into the attack part? These are just the basics on architecture. I didn't
So
talk about
what is
anything.
being meant by victim caches? Like, why is an exclusive cache, both of them are labeled victim, while an inclusive or non-inclusive L1 is not labeled as victim?
No, here the notion of victim is whenever something is kicked out from L1, L2, then only you allocate in LLC.
Yeah.
But in previous case, there is no binding. Whenever you kick out something from private cache, it goes out. That's all. There is no relationship.
No. So why? Which cache is being called as victim, and why is that so?
Yeah, the last level cache is actually known as the victim cache because it's storing all the victims of the private caches. Right? Whatever blocks that you decided to evict, right? They are actually victim blocks. And this guy is actually storing all the victim blocks coming from the private cache.
Okay. So we are calling the evicted blocks as victim blocks, and therefore.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So let me move on to the attack part, and hopefully in next 10-15 minutes we'll be able to understand a basic attack. So the first of its kind is called flush-based attack. Uh, don't worry about the semantic of this particular attack. Just try to understand what can happen. So let's say there is a spy and a victim, and as we have already discussed, there is some control flow dependency, right? So depending on a secret bit, you access some particular address, otherwise you don't access, right? So what attacker can do is, assuming attacker has access to that particular address, let's say address A, the attacker can flush it. Okay. So the notion of flush is you are actually invalidating that line from the cache hierarchy. The particular address won't be available in the cache hierarchy after the completion of this flush instruction. Okay. Then you start a timer. Okay. So there are instructions that gives you the current cycle time. Then you access the same address again. Okay. Remember, you have already flushed it. That means no one can bring it in between, right? Unless some co-running process is actually working on it and they are bringing this address into this cache, right? Then you put an end into the timer and try to find out the difference the latency actually for loading this particular address. So if it is fast, that means the victim has actually accessed it because you have flushed it out, And if it is slow, that means victim hasn't accessed it because you have flushed it out. Obviously, the data is not there in the cache. That's why you will get the data from memory. So this is the high level flush based attack where the attacker flushes something and tries to reload and then observe the timing difference. OK. So basically, the timing channels that we have been discussing or that we will be discussing, they fall into two categories. One is the side channel timing channel attack, and another is the covert channel attack. So in the side channel attack, it's actually an unintended channel. That's why it's called side channel. It's like, even if your software is secure, it has its own crypto guarantees and everything. Just because your software is sharing the cache along with other processes, or let's say spy, the spy can actually get the information from the software, right? So that's why it's called a side channel attack. It's unintended, but still because of the microarchitectural implementation, you will be able to get a timing difference, and based on that, you can deduce what exactly are the secret or some secret addresses, right? The other attack is actually not an attack, which is known as covert channel attack, where there are two spies who are actually trying to communicate, even if they are not supposed to communicate. So imagine from the operating system point of view, the OS has put a barrier that, OK, this guy should not communicate with this guy, right? Let's say it's process P1, this is process P2, and inter-process communication is not possible, right? But through caches, they can communicate. How? Let's say this guy wants to communicate ones and zeros to the other guy, right? It can just simply say that, OK, whenever you get a fast access time, it's 0. Whenever you get a slow access time, it's 1. And through that, you can actually play a game sending requests to the last level cache. And finally, this guy will be able to deduce what exactly you want to communicate, right? So this is actually intended. OK, so where both the parties know that they are playing a game, but here it's not. Here the victim doesn't have any clue. OK, that's the primary difference between a side channel and a covert channel. So we will mostly look into the last level cache attack. The last level is shared by multiple processes or multiple cores. And the basis of these attacks is getting data from DRAM because of LLC miss is actually way, it takes longer compared to getting the data from the cache itself, in the last level cache itself, right? And so there are various kinds of, side channel, covert channel attacks that are possible through caches. One of them is actually with the usage of something called a CL+ instruction. We'll go through that today. Other two we will discuss slowly later, but today we'll focus only on the flush-based attack. OK, so let's see what exactly it is. For the interest of time, I'm not showing this part now. We will go into the flush-based attack first, and then we'll talk about the other attacks, the eviction-based attack. So we have already taken the question. So let's understand the flush-based attack, and then we'll take questions. So in the flush-based attack, it's also known as a shared memory attack. OK, so it's a bit subtle. The assumption here is both attacker and victim, they are sharing memory. When I say sharing memory, that doesn't mean they are sharing cache. OK, sharing memory meaning you can take an example of a shared library, which is mapped to both attacker and victim. Let's say there is a shared crypto library that you are using, and then even your friend is using, and both of you are actually accessing a remote machine, right? So that's what I'm talking about here, right? So the different processes can actually share a library, and when they share a library, that means the addresses of those shared libraries are actually visible to both attacker and victim. OK, so that's the first criteria for flush and reload attack, because you want to flush a particular address. For that, you need an address. You should know that, OK, this is the address of interest. OK. So what happens in the step 0, which is not a attack step, the spy actually maps the shared library, which means the shared library is mapped to both attacker and victim in their respective address space. And then it uses a CL flush instruction. So CL flush means flushing a cache line. That's why the CL comes into picture. And by definition, what it does, it invalidates that particular cache line or a cache block from the entire, memory hierarchy or entire cache hierarchy. So you have to provide an address and you have to use this instruction. once this instruction is committed or completed, then you will be pretty sure that that address is not present in any of the cache levels. Okay. While flushing the particular line or a particular block, if a particular block contains modified data, that means dirty data, it will make sure that the data is written back to the memory. It's like writing back the data into the memory because you are flushing out the content of the cache. Okay. So this is a high level definition of CL flush. It needs a virtual address that is visible to the programmer. And once you provide that, it will go and search in the entire cache hierarchy that where exactly the address is present, and it will invalidate it. Okay. So now the first step is the spy or the attacker flushes the cache block. It knows the address. Then let's say the victim is actually using it. So because it's using it, it will reload that block, right? Let's say the address which are part of the shared library that will be reloaded by the victim. And in the last step, the attacker will try to reload, right? And once it reloads, now it will either get a hit or a miss. If it gets a hit, that means the victim has brought the block, right? Because it has already flushed it out. If it gets a miss, that means nothing is conclusive because I have flushed it out and I don't know whether victim has actually accessed in between or it is just sitting idle, right? So this is the typical flush and reload attack that we'll provide the source code today, and then you can play with it maybe over this week, right? So some of the obvious questions that comes like how do you?
Sir,
Yeah.
excuse me, one question. So
Yeah.
in the flush step, you said that it will invalidate the cache line.
Mhm.
So whether it will invalidate it or replace it with some other blocks.
No. It will invalidate. It won't replace. It's not a replacement instruction.
Okay, so to
Yeah.
invalidate it has to write some data to
No,
that
nothing.
particular.
It will just go to the tag bits and it will change the V bit to I bit. That's all.
Okay.
So, sir, but this should be this should happen in shared memory, right? So, but this if the program, if the process is running on some core,
Mhm.
so does that instruction, the CL plus you mentioned, have the reach to invalidate the cache block in LLC?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Um,
why not make this CL flush instruction restricted? Like, are there any
Yeah.
other users?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe can someone say why we need CL plus? Because as a user, you can actually, CL plus an address, which is a big deal. Is there a legitimate use of CL plus? If not, think about it. Think about it, and then we can discuss it over here.
CL flash, sorry, CL flash doesn't invalidate the cache blocks of the other core's private cache, right? It's only doesn't.
No. It invalidates. That's what. If you look at the definition, right? So
Yeah.
hang on. It says it goes to the cache coherence domain. So I haven't talked about cache coherence domain, but cache coherence domain meaning no matter which core, which private level, which shared level, it will just search everywhere in the entire cache hierarchy. If it is there, it will invalidate.
Okay.
Okay. We will go to the cache coherence maybe sometime next month, but for the timing, just assume that it will be invalidated no matter where it is.
Sure.
So maybe some sort of manual override.
Sorry?
So it exists because of the need of some manual override maybe.
What do you mean by manual override?
In the sense, manual override in the sense, if I want to like deallocate all the memory that is given to one application, something like that.
No, not precise. But anyway, maybe you guys think about it and I'll put it on Piazza, then we can discuss in more detail, right? Instead of just thinking, what exactly is the usage of CL plus. You can Google it also. I am pretty sure you will get some response, right? So let me just move forward in the interest of time, right? So we talked about the notion of differentiating a hit from a miss or from faster access from a slower access, right? So there are instructions which are already there. One of them is like RDTSC that gives you a particular, cycle count. At a given point of time, it will give you how many CPU clock cycles have been passed since last time it was reset. Okay, assuming it's a 64-bit instruction. So sometime it gets reset to 0 and then it starts, right? So when you want to measure the latency for a particular load, you have to put a RDTSC before you access, right? Before you access the load. And then you have to put a RDTSC after you make the load, right? And the difference between those two RDTSC numbers will be the actual cycle time. Okay. There are some other, subtle points, but at a high level, this is what you want. You need an instruction that can give you the cycle number, and then you can play with it so that you will be able to deduce whether it's a slow or fast access. Another key point here is, again, I'm providing a high level overview. The modern processors are out of order processor. What does it mean? It means, if these are the instructions that are entering into the processor pipeline, right? Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the order. There is no guarantee that this will be the order that you eventually get, executed. So just to improve performance or just to improve the instruction level parallelism, the processor tries to find out independent instruction, and it may happen that, this instruction 5 may get over before instruction 1, right? And then this is completely, out of order execution as long as there is no dependency. And if that's the case, and if you have the CL+ instruction and RDTSC, your latency number will be completely noisy, because now you are not sure whether when you made a load and after that if you have done a RDTSC, whether this RDTSC is actually for that load or something else along with the load, right? So you need some fence instructions. So fence instructions, as the name suggests, you need to put a barrier, kind of put a restriction that, okay, from this point onward, no instruction can move forward unless I'm done, right? So there are various kinds of fence instructions that you will find, especially in x86, like LFence. It stands for load fence, store fence, and memory fence. Again, instead of me saying it or me explaining it, we'll provide you the code. You go and play around with it and see what's the effect, right? You will find different latency numbers depending on how you are using it. Okay. So the key here is you need a mechanism through which you have to make sure that when you are deducing or you are calculating the latency, you are actually calculating the latency to access a particular memory address. Okay, and nothing else. So maybe I will stop here and then we will discuss about the other things. So there is another attack called flush and flush. It is same as flush and reload. The only difference is the last step. In the last step, the reload is replaced by a flush. This is a more stealthy attack because you are not making any memory accesses, right? The attacker is just flushing continuously. You can imagine there is a for loop within which the attacker is keep on flushing, right? But it's pretty noisy because the latency difference that you will find in flush and flush attack, it's pretty noisy. Can someone say why flush and flush attack will be useful? How can you differentiate a hit from a miss? In the reload attack, if you remember, right? In the last step, I was saying if you get a reload hit, that means the victim has accessed it. If you get a miss, that means that there was no victim access, right? So now with the flush and flush, how can you infer anything?
We can observe the time required to execute the flush instruction.
Okay,
If the
and then
cache blocks are there in the cache hierarchy, then flush will take more time because it is
okay,
already there.
okay.
Some other
Yeah.
process brought it.
Yeah, so it's actually counterintuitive. So if you get a cache hit, now the latency will be more. Why? Because if there is a block, you have to flush it out. You have to invalidate it, and then if it is dirty, you have to put the data back into DRAM, right? But if there is no address present, then the CL flush instruction will finish fast or faster, right? So in the previous case, you on a hit, you are assuming that victim has actually accessed it. In this case, when you get a hit, it means victim hasn't accessed it, right? So that's how it is. Okay. So you won't go to the other attacks, but let me just show you these three things that we discussed today. So the job of an attacker is, first you need to find out the latency threshold based on which you will say that, okay, this particular access is actually from cache or memory. Then you should know what are the addresses of interest. In case of flush reload attack, it's pretty easy because the addresses are mapped to both attacker and victim. And then finally, once the attack is done, then you will be able to get a sequence of zeros and ones. Let's say the bits that we have been discussing, right? We will provide you these links. So these are the papers. There are videos also for these attacks. You can go through it. And the source code is also there. You have to just follow the README and try to mount a flush reload attack on your laptop. Okay. So with that, I will stop and we can take some questions maybe for next 10 minutes. So Devasis, you may stop the recording.